Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 47th in our Middle Eastern History series. This is on the Turkish War of Independence, and we'll cover the period roughly between the years 1918 and 1923. So here are the rules for those of you who may be unfamiliar. The first thing is this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the subjects that we are discussing. I'm actually a lawyer by training. And accordingly, I'm going to try and give this from a secular perspective. I'm not going to try and bias it in favor of either side in the Turkish War of Independence. I'm going to try and do it as even-handedly as possible. Now, given that this is a sensitive topic, and of course, sensitive topics will be discussed tonight, please be respectful of other opinions. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put them in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond to questions in due time as I give my presentation. The next thing is that the class will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean I will cover the basics. That's the 101. So if you don't know what's going on, I'll catch you up. And 201, if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. So don't worry, I'll cover both parts in my discussion. The next thing is that I have what's called a 2-hour hard stop. So when we get to 9 o'clock in the evening, whatever slide I'm on, that's the last slide I'm going to do that night, and it'll roll over into the next night that we have a presentation. That's that next Thursday. So don't worry if you can't stay for more than 2 hours. I'm not staying much longer either. That said, if we have a really great conversation, we can keep having that conversation. Just no new material will be discussed. 7, when I put dates below a person, that's usually their years of service. That's not when they were born or died, right? It could be when they were president, general, prime minister, secretary of war, whatever it was. Those dates are their years of service in that role. Number 8, this is a recording like the other 46 members in this series and the other series on omnicarta.org or on YouTube. These are recorded so you can watch them later and sort of see the trajectory of the various parts of the Middle East moving forward through time. And we ask that you please subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is called History, Fitness, and Investing. The link is there and it's also in the chat. And also, we do appreciate PayPal donations. All that we do comes from people like you who really enjoy this content and think that it's worth remunerating. All right, so if we remember, we were coming out of the First Balkan War. That was the last major engagement before World War I. And in that Balkan War, a lot of previously Ottoman territory in the southeastern part of Europe, that region is called, the larger region is called Balkans. The area occupied by the Ottoman Empire was called Rumelia. Rumelia was conquered by the Bulgarians, and the Ottomans were forced to retreat. And this retreat gave rise to a coup d'etat, leading to the ascension of 3 leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Ahmed Jamal Pasha. These 3 individuals formed the Committee of Union and Progress Triumvirate, the Committee of Union and Progress being their party, triumvirate meaning that there were 3 of them ruling. And as we discussed in the last 4 presentations, they were in charge of the country during World War I and really dictated the policy of the Ottoman Empire in its final days. Despite there still being a sultan, the sultan had very little direct control over policy. It was really these 3 individuals who had that control. And when the Greeks, Serbians, and Bulgarians took over Rumelia, we began to see a lot of massacres and ethnic cleansings perpetrated by those Christian powers against the people of Rumelia. And this was both against Muslims who happened to be in the region. In fact, as well, as we've talked about, 1.5 million Muhajir or Muslims were migrating from Anatolia from Rumelia to Anatolia, but also the Christians disagreed with each other, forcing Christians to take on other Christian identities than the ones that they had. primarily Greeks and Serbians trying to Hellenize or Serbicize the Bulgarian-speaking population. But also we should be clear that not all the people who spoke a Bulgarian language identified as being part of Greater Bulgaria. And so you had Bulgarians trying to Bulgarify what we would today anachronistically call North Macedonians. So, and at the same time, we have Greeks being kicked out of areas controlled by Bulgaria and Serbs being kicked out of areas controlled by Bulgaria as well. And so we have this internecine struggle between Christians as they're trying to take over control of the Balkans according to their nationalistic predilections. In particular, those who are familiar with the history in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, know very well that the country of North Macedonia today has its own historiography that is directly coming out of this period when Serbia controlled Northern Macedonia. And if you're curious about more about that, I do have a presentation on the website about the Macedonian identity and how that has been created, but it comes right out of this period. So we have to understand a little bit about what was going on during World War I in terms of the political orientation of the Ottoman Empire to understand what the Turkish War of Independence really was coming out of, what atmosphere. And it comes out of this reaction to what the Ottoman Empire used to be. The Ottoman Empire was a pluricentric society. Of course, the ruling elite were ethnically Turkish and were speaking the Turkish language, but that was simply how that ruling family was structured and had very little to do with the national identity of the people below them. And this is something that we often sort of take for granted in today's day and age, is that a people should be ruled by people who are like them in some sort of way that is defining to the nation. Throughout the majority of history, people have been ruled by people who were not like them at all. And that was generally the way it went. Remember, for example, that the kings and queens of the United Kingdom today are from a German dynasty, right? The House of Windsor was originally the House of Saxe-Gotha. And before them, it was the House of Orange, right? Which was a Dutch house, Oranje-Nassau, right? So this idea, right, that we should be ruled by people who are like us is a modern creation, is a modern development of nationalism. And this nationalism affected the areas in the Middle East just as much as it affected areas in Europe. And in fact, at a much more accelerated timescale because of how many changes were happening in such quick succession. So the philosophy that was leading the CUP triumvirate was an idea of Turanism or Turkification. And these terms are slightly different, but they really come down to the same sort of thing, that the Ottoman Empire was truly a Turkish state, a state of Turks. Now, what that means is going to be defined differently at different periods, but suffice it to say that it is not a cosmopolitan nation in the way that the Ottoman Empire was. For example, you can see that multilingual sign in Constantinople. On the top, you see Ottoman Turkish written in the Arabic script. On the left-hand lower side, you can see Armenian script, and on the lower right-hand side, you can see Greek script, right? Because those areas of Constantinople had people of those three ethnicities commonly moving about. And so you would need to be able to communicate with all of them. This Turanism, this Turkification, believed that Turkish should be the dominant language. And there were several different manifestations of Turanism and Turkification. The first was this idea of the great Turkish nation, that all the Turks throughout the world should unite under one Turkish government. And you can sort of see this with the oversized map of Turkey extending into the Caucasus region and then into the Trans-Caucasus, all the way through Lake Baikal, that all of the areas that had previously been under Turkish control or with dominant ethnically Turkic population should be in one great Turanic state, right? Turan being an old term for Turks. And you can see in this particular iteration, it has one of Atatürk's very famous phrases, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene," happy is he that says he is a Turk, is probably the best translation. There are different ones. But this idea that Turks around the world should unite under one grand Turkish state. You also have things like the Sun theory, Sun language theory, which was the idea that Turkish was the first language in the world, and that all other languages are derived from bastardized versions of Turkish. So in truth, all the world are Turks, but only the Turks remember their Turkish origins. And accordingly, the process of re-Turkifying people is a process of helping people to understand their origins rather than a deracination, which it, of course, is for anybody who doesn't identify that way. And because of this sort of idea that people are being returned to the proper Turkishness, you have schools built throughout the Arab world that try to teach the Arabs Turkish to Turkify them. That slowly changes as the Ottoman Empire becomes weaker and weaker. So now these Muhajirs are moving into Anatolia, and I want to give a sense of the scope of how big this was. If you look at Turkish citizens today, if you take those who are claim descendancy from Muhajir, they're about 17% of the population of Turkey today. And to give sort of perspective on that, the percentage of Blacks in the United States today is 12%. So that should give you an idea of how important they are in terms of being a contributor to the economy and a contributor in terms of political aspirations of Turkey. And you can imagine, having been expelled from their homeland in Rumelia, they were not terribly keen to be forgiving towards the Christian minorities in their midst once they moved into Anatolia. To complicate matters further, in many cases, because of the Greek genocide, the Assyrian genocide, and the Armenian genocide, many areas within the Ottoman Empire became open, for want of a better term. The property was vacated. And so those provided places for these Muhajir to move into. And not only was this an occurrence that occurred simply because these areas were available, but this was actually encouraged by the government under the CUP triumvirate, which would further inflame any tensions between the Muhajir and the Christian minorities, because now there's a direct property interest between those two groups, that they're occupying the same homes, they're occupying the same areas. And this was part of the CUP's idea of Turkifying Turkey, not just convincing people that were already Turks that they were Turks, but increasing the number of places where people who call themselves Turks were living. And at the same time, towards the beginning of World War I, we begin to see the signs of what would eventually become the Greek genocide. And in particular, we have the boycott against Greek businesses. Because of a number of capitulations, which are treaties that the Ottoman Empire signed with the foreign powers, Greeks have been able to acquire significant amounts of wealth through the creation of businesses that were insured by those capitulations. Now, the capitulations were from the 16, 17, and 1800s, but the period that we're talking about right now is 1914. So in 1914, for example, we have Turkish çetes, and we're going to see these çetes a lot. Çetes are these roving nomadic bands of militant fighters, completely irregular, and usually based in the countryside, preying upon a local city or town. And these çetes attacked the Greek city of Phocaia. It's today the Turkish city of Foça on the Aegean coast of Turkey. And that led to what was called the Phocaia massacre, in which a number of Greeks were killed and their property stolen. You also had Greeks expelled from certain areas like Ayvalık, starting in this period. And the businesses that those Greeks had set up some from the result of these capitulations, some from the result of Greeks' own ingenuity and connectedness within the community, were boycotted by the Ottoman government, driving a lot of those businesses into the ground. This gets us to the point of the Greek genocide, and we're going to revisit it in time, but we should understand the different regions of Greece, so that way when we talk about the Greek world in the Ottoman Empire, so that way when we talk about them, it's a little clearer. If you can see the map at the top, you can see, for example, that area in orange towards the northeast, centered on the city of Trebizond, modern Trabzon. That is the Pontic Greek population. Now, Pontic Greeks have their own dialect of Greek, as do the Cappadocian Greeks. Those are the ones in the green towards the center of Anatolia. And Ionian Greeks speak much the same way as Greeks in what we call Greece today. And that's the yellow there. But despite the fact that they have slightly different accents, they are members of the same Greek Orthodox Church. They would consider themselves brothers and part of the same Greek nation. However, because the political distinction exists between the Greeks of the Pontus and the Greeks of Ionia, I'm going to call them Pontians just for the sake of clarity. We have moments of deportation in the Greek genocide as early as I pointed out in 1914, but we have other cases that are not that far after. The Ottoman Empire had numerous German commanders in its cadre, and one of these was General Liman von Sanders. You can see him in the bottom, and Liman von Sanders was posted on Gallipoli, right? He was, we talked about Gallipoli the last two times we met, and while he was there, he also noticed that significant portions of Greeks existed in the southwest of Turkey. You can see all those green dots on the map. Those are points of origin for Greek deportations. Those red dots are points of destination for those deportations. And so he noticed that there were a lot of Greeks in the southwest part of Turkey, southwest part of Anatolia, and he said that they should be deported inland. And so that's what happened. In one particularly grueling case, you have the city of Levisi. Levisi is the Greek name for the city. The modern Turkish name is Kayaköy, which is in that same region. And it was an entirely Greek town in the mountains. And because of the massacre that occurred when trying to get the Greeks out, Turks refused to move in to those homes. It's a rare exception to that rule that I just explained, where the Muhajirs took over places that have been abandoned by Armenians and Greeks. The Turks refused to move in primarily because they believed that the houses were inhabited by ghosts, the ghosts of those who had died. And so they would never find rest in those homes because those ghosts would antagonize them. And that has survived as sort of local mythology up till the present day. Now, the question, of course, becomes, we see all these red dots on the map. They don't seem to point to any central location. What was the point if that wasn't the case? There are sort of two answers to this. The first one is that they actually were deported to a central location. It's just that the deportations were not consistent in terms of, because this map charts the first deportation. Deportations occurred in sequence. So you'd be deported from location A, you'd be taken to location B, from location B, and so on. One of the prominent areas where people were gathered was in the city of Elazığ. And Elazığ is in the eastern part of Turkey. For those of you who are more familiar with the Armenian name, this is the region of Harput. And from that southeastern region within Turkey, they would be deported out further east. There's a question as to what are the numbers in the dots. The numbers in the dots correlate the same group. So for example, if you look in the southwest of Turkey, you can see the number 277. And if you look just due east of it, maybe about 200 kilometers, right, you see a red 277. The reason for that is that, right, you have that the green 277 is where the population started. The red 277 is where they ended after the first move. Now, so that's the first answer. The second answer is that in many cases, the Greeks who were deported were sent to work on what were called the labor battalions. And the labor battalions were forced labor throughout the Ottoman Empire, usually to build Ottoman infrastructure or to work in Ottoman factories. Many Greeks and Armenians were put to work in Ottoman factories during the war in order to produce munitions, more railroad track, other military equipment, so uniforms, things like this. They were not financially compensated in any way. nor was their health and safety protected. And many Greeks and Armenians died for being part of these labor battalions. We talked about that during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire suffered particularly hard. And I wanted to, again, make this comparison between the Ottoman Empire and France. France lost 1.4 million people, and that's nothing to laugh about. That is a very serious number. But we should look at their total population. It's nearly 40 million people, which is around a 4% loss, right? We're talking about a 3-4% loss here. The Ottoman Empire pre-war population was 21.3 million, and they lost 800,000 soldiers, which is roughly 5-6%. So the military cost was much higher on a per capita basis. And then, of course, you take into effect the civilian numbers. Now, half of that number, that 4.2 million, half of that number, or a little bit more than half, are the genocides, granted. But you still have roughly 2 million Turkish Muslim deaths that are occurring in that civilian population. So areas of the Ottoman Empire were severely depopulated. And you have a situation that's very different than the situation in France, where you had large areas of the Ottoman Empire that were on the verge of economic collapse, areas that were not functioning in any reasonable way. Never mind the fact that the Allies were making significant advances, well, the British were making significant advances in the Palestine campaign and in the Mesopotamian campaign. But just because the Allies were advancing in the south doesn't mean that the Allies were advancing on all fronts, right? In 1917, Russia pulled out of the war, and the Ottoman Empire fought back and retook those areas in blue. Those were areas conquered by the Russians in the first 3 years of World War I, and they continued to push forward against all of the remaining entities in the Caucasus region that had managed to break away from Russia during the Russian Civil War. That is the Transcaucasian Republic, and then its subsidiary entities of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The Armenians were only able to defeat the Ottomans at one pitched battle in Sadarabad. There were a number of smaller battles the Armenians also won very close to it, like Karakilis. But Sadarabad was really the massive victory. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in 2 weeks when we talk about the Caucasian Wars. But this was really what saved Armenia in many respects, because as the Ottoman army was moving further and further east, they were still continuing to deport Armenian populations that they came in contact with, as well as arresting and killing the ARF, the Dashnak Sütçü, which was a terrorist militant organization organized by Armenians to resist Ottoman predations. The Armenian soldiers were poorly equipped, but they were able to defeat the cannons on the battlefield less than 10 kilometers away from Etchmiadzin, which is the capital city of the Armenian church. Think of it like Rome for the Catholics, right? And Sadarabad was very close to there. Had the battle gone the other way, it's very likely that Armenia would have been crushed by the Ottoman Empire, and there wouldn't be an Armenia today. But because of the Ottoman failures on the southern fronts, eventually they had to surrender to the British, and they did so on the HMS Agamemnon to Sir Somerset Calthorpe, and Calthorpe managed to set the stage for the future relationship between Britain and the Ottoman Empire that would result in partitioning. So just to give a general idea of where the borders were at the time of surrender, you can see that sort of red triangle line that extends across the center of the Middle East and then over through the Caucasus region. So it's this weird situation where they're retreating from those British advances in green throughout Palestine and Mesopotamia, but at the same time they're advancing um, in the Caucasus region, and those advances will be called back on account of the Ottoman surrender. Now, as we mentioned last time, World War I was not ended by one treaty. Everybody talks about the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a treaty that ended the war between the Entente Powers and Germany. It did not end the war between the Entente Powers and any of the other states involved in World War I. And we talked about the Treaty of Saint-Germain, and we talked about the Treaty of Trianon last time. Today, we're going to talk about the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine, and of course, the Treaty of Sevres and the conditions surrounding it. But I want to take notice of something, right? The armistice occurred in the case of the Ottoman Empire in October of 1918, which was not that different than the German or Austro-Hungarian armistices, roughly the same time, maybe a month or two different. But these peace treaties were not made in October of 1918. They were made months later, in many cases, years later. And so the situation on the ground had changed substantially during the discussions for these treaties. And we're going to see just how that looks in the Ottoman case. One of the things is that we had a conflict of interest when adjudicating the Ottoman situation between the Americans on one side and the British and French on the other. The Americans believed very firmly, or rather, it's better to say Woodrow Wilson believed very fervently. Most Americans were not interested in internationalist policy for the United States. The United States was very isolationist in this period. But Woodrow Wilson was interested in the idea of self-determination, that each people should be able to decide on its own how they wish to govern. And then you had the opposite position from the British and the French. They believed that they should have a continued role in advising, a different role in advising and controlling those territories, especially the British, who had spent a lot of blood and treasure to take these territories. And so you had what was called the mandate system develop. And we're going to go a lot more into how this functioned and how the Middle East was drawn up when we get to French and British mandates in probably about a month. But suffice it to say that the mandate system that was created was that the League of Nations would have the ability to advise on when people were ready for independence. So in purpose, it wasn't a colony. In terms of how it was governed, it absolutely was a colony. And this created a lot of friction. But it's important to note that there were three classes in the mandate system. Mandate class A, meaning that the people were suitably ready to self-govern, but they needed the last bit of teaching to get them there. Mandate class B, meaning that a country is on the verge of being ready for self-governance, but significant time and investment would be involved. And class C, meaning that there was no possibility in any foreseeable future of that mandate ever having governing capability, but will give them the chance eventually. The mandates in the Middle East, it may surprise people to find out, were actually class A. Class B mandates were primarily in Africa. Class C mandates were primarily in the Pacific Ocean. So at least from the perspective of the great powers at this time, the Entente powers, the Middle Eastern countries should have some ability, rudimentary ability to govern themselves. And the question would just be about when. There's a question I have here of, did the various treaties have different reparations or concessions from the Central Powers? Absolutely they did. Germany's reparations were by far the largest, but some of them, for example, the reparations on Bulgaria, were significantly harsher from a per capita standpoint, even though the absolute number was lower. You have different territorial requirements and concessions. You have different situations that developed in the different countries. For example, right, with the case of Hungary, we talked about cordon sanitaire, or the sanitary cordon, which deprived it of a lot of Hungarian majority territories outside of its borders. But conversely, one of those territories that was taken away from Hungary was assigned to Austria because it had a German majority, right? Which was respecting Austria's right to national integrity. So these peace treaties absolutely did have distinct elements. That said, the basis of each of these treaties with the exception of Sevres, for reasons that we're going to discuss, was primarily based on Versailles and would include things like provisions for the League of Nations, the war guilt clause for Germany was in all of them, and things like that, which generally asserted Allied victory and the New World Order. There's a question here: who decides on the mandate system? The mandate system was to be overseen by the League of Nations, right? That's the sort of prototype for the United Nations that Woodrow Wilson sets up in his 14 points and eventually gets integrated into the Treaty of Versailles. It would be the League of Nations that would be responsible for overseeing the mandates. Some of these mandates continued after the League of Nations was dismantled in the wake of the Second World War, and those would become UN trusteeships. At current, there are no more UN trusteeships. The last one became independent in 1994. That was Palau, which was, I believe, a Class C mandate at this point. So, better late than never. There's a question here: was anything done proactively to prevent the de facto colonialism, or was it always set up as sort of a wink-wink scenario? I think the British and the French, to the degree that they were arguing that the mandates would eventually become independent, was entirely disingenuous. I think that from the perspective of the Americans arguing on behalf of such a system, they were doing it earnestly. But the thing is that the United States was not interested in taking a prominent international position. So when it became clear that these mandates would not be administered from this sort of towards independence and respecting the nationalities' desires perspective, they didn't intervene. And so that gave the British and the French the ability to run the Middle East as they saw fit. We're going to now discuss the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine, and I just wanted to touch on a few important points of the treaty. The first was that the Bulgarians were forced to cede specific territories. Now, you can see those territories on the map in red. They gave to Greece the territory of Komotini, or Western Thrace, which was the outlet that Bulgaria had to the Aegean Sea. And so Bulgaria was now cut off and only had Black Sea coast. This was a huge deal, and it also meant that Greece and Greece and the Ottoman Empire now had a land border. And this was key because Greece wanted to create a circle around the Aegean. This helped precipitate that and showed the possibility of expansion in this direction. You can also see that along the Serbian border, there are 4 territories that were ceded to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. As we mentioned last time, the Kingdom of Serbia basically expanded to include the Croats and Slovenes and the Montenegrins, believing that they wouldn't be destroyed by any localized power as easily if they were united. But these areas were areas that were tactically important for the defense of the eastern frontier of Serbia historically, and so Serbia demanded these territories. But by and large, in terms of land, Bulgaria was rather spared compared to Germany, or especially Austria-Hungary, which was entirely dismantled. The other, or the Ottoman Empire, which lost the entire Middle East to these mandates. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that although Bulgaria, as I said, had one of the largest reparations per capita, successful negotiation effectively meant that Bulgaria never had to pay any of it. And the Allies stopped demanding it after a few years. So what are some other effects here? The next one is that Tsar Frederick, who had led the Bulgarians into war, resigned, and he resigned to the socialists led by Stamboliski. And there was an increasing fear by the Entente Powers that Bulgaria was going to become a communist country, given Stamboliski's leanings. And so they decided to support Boris III, Frederick's son, to become the new king of Bulgaria. And he would become king until 1943. During the first decade or so of his reign, Boris was relatively tolerant of minority parties, but starting in 1934, he became effectively an absolute monarch and controlled his country directly until he died of natural causes in 1943. one of the interesting ironies, of course, is that he brought Bulgaria into World War II on the side of the Axis powers. But because of Germany's trepidation towards the Republic of Turkey at that time, he actually managed to stay out of most of the war, saying that Bulgaria would keep the Ottomans from invading the German Empire, and accordingly managed to do that. He also managed to be one of the few Axis states that protected its Jewish population. It wasn't a large number of Jews to begin with, but most Jews in Bulgaria were not deported or otherwise put in concentration camps. One of the strange ironies. And the stranger part of that irony is exactly how this war ended, which is that you ended up with a lot of Bulgarians living in this Western Thrace region when Greece occupied it. And there were additionally Greeks north of that position within the territory of Bulgaria. And so part of the agreement between the two sides was that 46,000 Greeks from Bulgaria would be deported into both Western Thrace and the rest of Greece, and 92,000 Bulgarians would be deported from Greece into Bulgaria. This was the first major population swap, and we'll see that this idea continues for much of the next few decades, being, quote, the sensible way, end quote, to end ethno-national struggles. You can imagine how many lives were uprooted and how difficult this was for the Greeks who were living in Bulgaria, as well as the Bulgarians who were living in what would now become Greece. And it created undue hardship, but at the same time, it removed the irredentist claims because now there were no longer people of the other's religion in their territory. There's a question I have here. Well, what was the logic for Bulgaria for having a higher reparations burden per capita? I think it was just the way it was negotiated. I think that at that point, the Allies were more interested in the money, and so they weren't doing the calculation of per capita. They were just doing the rough numbers calculation. Bulgaria had a substantially smaller population than either Austria or Germany, so the number looked smaller, but they didn't do the math. That would be my intuition, but I don't know. And why is there no enforcement mechanism to make them pay? No, there was an enforcement mechanism. The Allies, the Entente Powers, decided that they weren't going to force the issue. They just they would rather have Bulgaria stable and non-communist than force them to pay. So one other thing that I want to do before we continue forward is sort of get our geographic bearings, because we're going to be moving a lot within the region of Anatolia throughout the presentation. So the area in that green circle in the west, that's going to be the Greek front, and that's going to be the Greco-Turkish War. The area in light blue towards the south, that's going to be the Franco-Turkish War. That's going to be the French front. The area in the purple circle, that's going to be the Armenian front, and that's going to be the Turco-Armenian War. All of these combined are the Turkish War of Independence. And that area in sort of the green oval that intersects with the purple circle, that's where the Pontic Greeks are, right? So when we're talking about the Turkish War of Independence, we're talking about a war where the fighting, to say it's constantly on all three sides is incorrect, but you're going to be having multiple fronts moving as we get through this story. And we should always remember that there's different groups invading at different points. Also, if you see where it says 500 kilometers on the inside of the Greco-Turkish circle, you'll also notice that area of southeastern Turkey is also delimited by a dotted line. That's the dotted line of the Italian invasion. And so when we talk about the Italians, we're talking about that area as well. There's one last thing that I want to point out. If you look, you can see Ankara is in Anatolia outside of any of these circles, right? Ankara is in the Anatolian highlands. That's completely different from Istanbul, which is very close to the coast. And we're going to see how that physical distance is going to be very important in understanding the Turkish War of Independence. All right. So after World War I, the Allies begin to occupy Constantinople, and Sultan Mehmet VI accepts these allies taking control. Um, he sees to it that the Freedom and Liberty Party, which was the opposition to the CUP, comes to power, and they're led by two different Grand Viziers. You have Damat Farid Pasha and Ali Reza Pasha, a different Ali Reza than Ahmed Reza that you're probably thinking of from the other discussions. These two individuals end up enforcing a number of edicts issued by the Entente Powers. And in fact, the Entente Powers begin to occupy Constantinople itself in various waves, and even divide Constantinople into quarters administered by each of them, right? The three Entente Powers in this case, right, because the Americans are not going to have a large-scale involvement here, are France, Britain, and Italy. And you can see them marching through what would become Istiklal Caddesi, or Independence Avenue. Of course, that's not the name that it had at this time. At this time, it was Rue de la Part in central Istanbul. And there were protests throughout the country denouncing this Allied occupation. It felt to many Turks that the Ottomans were being subject to a very different set of parameters than were the Germans, Austrians, or Bulgarians, in that their capitals were not occupied. Their populations were left relatively unmolested by the Entente Powers. We also have this case where the French wanted to move into Cilicia. Now, Cilicia is this region of Turkey that sort of bends around the northeasternmost point of the Mediterranean, and had been a historic place for Armenians prior to World War I. In fact, they had their own Catholicosate. We talked about this. And if you go back to some of the earlier episodes on the Crusades, we talked about also the foundation of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, which the French were trying to, in a certain way, rebuild. Now, the French motivation here was both the cultural connection that they had to the Armenians. The French had been working with the Armenians for centuries, primarily in negotiating their rights vis-a-vis the Ottomans, and the fact that they were Christian, and so they had that faith connection that the French desired. Additionally, the French had a historic relationship with the region of Syria and Lebanon. And because of that historic relationship, they wanted to extend those borders. And the most logical place to do that would be in Cilicia, because of the direct border between northern Syria and eastern Cilicia. The problem, of course, was, though, that very few French soldiers wanted to go defend France again. Remember, World War I was the war to end all wars, and France had experienced, as we pointed out, just south of 1.4 million war casualties. After the war had ended, it was now the armistice with Germany was signed in November 11th. So when we get to December, we're not having large numbers of most of these French soldiers had gone home, and we don't have a large number of French soldiers who want to re-enlist to go to battle. So what ends up happening is that the French actually ended up using Armenians as their military force. So the largest contingent of the French military was made of what was called the Armenian Legion. We also have contributions from other parts of the French Empire, rather unwillingly, of course, like the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, which are fighters from Senegal and the surrounding African countries. And this combined multinational force, right, all French, for want of a better term, but from various parts of the world, as well as some white French, but of course, as I pointed out, they're in the minority, led by Edouard Barremont. And we've seen him before. He was involved in the French landing in the Hijaz to help support the Arab revolt there. And the Armenians really supported the French in this because the French promised and delivered while they were there Armenian repatriation. Between 100 and 170,000, there are debates on the number, of Armenians that had been displaced during the Armenian genocide. They'd been forced marched into Syria, came up with the French soldiers, this multinational French force, into Cilicia, and began to rebuild their communities. Now, there's a question here. Was there any other chief French interest with the Armenians other than faith? What was it, countering the Ottomans? Of course, the French wanted to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. That was a chief goal of the French and the British. And so that was certainly in play here. I would also say that the French believed that they were re-Christianizing these territories that have been taken by the Ottoman Empire. Well, actually, technically by other Turkish states that had been absorbed by the Ottoman Empire. And re-Christianizing them and bringing them back into the fold of Western civilization. I think there's also this idea of prestige, that the more territories controlled, the more prestigious you were. So there are a lot of other motives, but in terms of these motives, the relationship between the French and the Armenians was probably the biggest in terms of motivating factors. But now, once you had this repatriation of Armenians to Cilicia, in fact, many of these Armenians had not come from Cilicia, right? Many of them did, but quite a number of them didn't. You began to have friction between the Armenians coming to reclaim their property, or claim property that had historically been Armenian, but was not necessarily their particular property, and the Turks who had moved in, many of them Muhajir, many of them angry about the possibility of giving up their territory to Christians. And you began to have this situation where there would be violence between the Turks and the Armenians over this new system, where the Armenians had more physical military might than the Turks had. And that's not to say that the Turks didn't have any might at all, right? In much of Cilicia, I don't know if you can tell from the map, but Cilicia is a very mountainous region. The Taurus Mountains stretch across the northern part of Cilicia. And the mountainous regions were particularly difficult places to enforce law and order. And so many of those areas, which were Turk majority, had large Chete contingents. And those Chetes, right, those militant bands, would come south from the mountains and attack the Armenians in the towns. But as I said, this was a French-led occupation, and the Armenian Legion held disproportionate power. The Armenian Legion bullied the Muslims under its control in order to help its own co-religionists. And so the French had basically stepped into and created a quagmire by giving the Armenians a leg up, so that way they would finally be equal enough to the Turks to fight on their own. This, of course, was not what France was expecting, and it was very difficult for the French commanders on the ground to try and stabilize the situation. Right, we need to point out that a lot of these territories, in many cases, the Armenians' claims were justified in that they had been given receipts for their properties that had been abandoned, and they could show these property receipts to say, these were our houses. But of course, the Turks who were living there didn't really care, especially if they had paid to live in those houses. And we know that many Turks had paid to live in confiscated houses because of, during the war, we have many cases where the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, was reallocating confiscated assets to Turks and charging them money for the assets that it had confiscated. Another issue that was going on at the same time was whether, to what extent the Armenians were actually free to be Armenian. Many Armenians have been taken by Arab families at this time, and so the Armenian Legion was operating in Syria as well, trying to convince Armenians that have been taken by Arabs and Arabicized to re-Armenify. And so you have what was called the Vorpa Havak, which was an attempt to re-Arabize Armenians within Syria. And some of those Armenians, in turn, would go to Cilicia, which further inflamed that conflict. Within Istanbul, under Allied occupation, there were several moves that were made in order to appease the Allies. by Farid Pasha, the Grand Vizier. One of these was to institute war crimes trials for those involved in the Armenian and Greek genocides. Now, one of the things is that after the Ottomans had signed the Armistice of Mudros in October of 1918, the CUP triumvirate fled and operated primarily from Berlin. So they couldn't be tried in these trials in person. All three of them were tried in absentia and found guilty. But that doesn't mean that the only people who were tried in absentia, even though a large portion of the CUP had fled. One person that I want to draw attention to in particular was Mehmet Kemal Bey. Mehmet Kemal was in the southwest of the country, and he was reported to have said, "I will not let a single Armenian still stand after I'm done." The testimony against him, as heard by the Istanbul trials, was found to be conclusive, and he was hung on the 10th of April, 1919. He is actually the first person to ever have been hung for war crimes. And the reaction among the Turks in the Ottoman Empire was universal condemnation, not of Mehmet Kemal, but of the process. And impartial observers remark that there were no circumstances under which the Turks, in the state that they were, would have accepted any kind of penalty for a person for having killed Christians. The courts martial found against and hung several other people in terms of the genocide. However, the Istanbul trials were not about whether a genocide had occurred necessarily. Obviously, that term wasn't used. And the war crimes were less specified. Furthermore, for those trying to use this as proof that the Armenian or Greek genocides did occur, a lot of the evidence for these trials was not well preserved, and in many cases was fumbled by the prosecution in such a way that it could never be used in any future trial. But the fact that a number of Ottomans were found guilty either in person or in absentia for crimes against the Christian population, such as massacres and wartime profiteering, was deeply angering to many of the Turks throughout the empire, who felt that this war crimes tribunal was unwarranted and that it didn't take into account the numbers of Turks who had died in the conflict and who were suffering because of the conflict. Nor were such trials ever held when the Muhajir were kicked out of Rumelia, and while 1.5 million made it to Anatolia, 200,000 still died, and there was no allied discussion about any of those situations. One thing I also want to point out is that during World War I, we talked about the Tashkilat-i Mahsusa, the special organization, and this was an organization originally responsible to Bahauddin Shakir, and eventually came under the purview of Mehmet Talat Pasha. This organization was a group of organized ruffians, in many cases, people who had been released from prison with a specific target against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, to murder them or to waylay them and to steal from them, but also as an intelligence organization, an intelligence gathering organization. And with Mehmet Talat in Germany, he continued to organize the Tashkilat-i Mahsusa, the special organization, but he did so through its new development called the Karakol Jamiyeti, or the Black Hand Society. And the Black Hand Society began to serve as a way of getting information between the various contingents of Turkish militants that were operating in the country, as well as Turkish military divisions. Because this was the second part of what Damat Farid Pasha was doing in order to acquiesce to the Allies' demands. Across the Ottoman Empire, the soldiers had to receive commands to stand down, to demobilize. And Damat Farid Pasha was doing this in accordance with the armistice signed at Mudros. But many of the different militants across the country and elements of the Ottoman military were thoroughly disinterested in demobilizing. they didn't see the threat from the Entente Powers as over. They didn't feel themselves broken. And so they wanted to continue the fight. And the Karakol Cemiyeti, the Black Hand Society, continued to ferret to them information, weapons, people, trying to get people out of Istanbul and into the Anatolian highlands. Eventually, they settled on the city of Ankara as the place where they would send these weapons and people to. Ankara being far enough away from Istanbul and from the areas under Entente occupation to be a place where the Turkish resistance could really gain strength. There's a question here of if the Black Hand had any particular ideological or cultural significance. I would say no. I think in this part of the world, we generally see Black to refer to any insurgent organization. That's very commonly used. Now, the Karakol Cemiyeti was trying to decide how it would organize the Ottoman situation in order to repel the invaders. And one of the possibilities that they seriously considered was assassinating the Sultan. But eventually, as we're going to see, the Sultan becomes too connected with the Entente Powers to be an effective point person, in that if they remove the Sultan, another Sultan who is equally acquiescent will take his place. That it would need to be a different style of government in order to be victorious in liberation from the Entente Powers. And part of that spun off from the Black Hand Society into what were called the Mudafa'a Hukuk Jamiyatleri, the associations for the defense of rights. Implicitly, these were the defensive rights of Turks, right? And these organizations were based on the principle of that you would have these societies that would sort of develop. These were a higher level of organization from the Çete, right? The Çete were sort of these irregular bands. They were disorganized. The Mudafa'a Hukuk Jamiyatleri, the defense of rights or societies, these were significantly more organized with a hierarchical structure. Sometimes they would have the involvement of military officers or former military officers, and they began to develop in the various vilayats or provinces of the Ottoman Empire. You can see, for example, on the right-hand side, this is from the Sharqiya vilayat. You can also see, in addition to these kinds of associations, you also had militant groups that began to form very similarly to these groups, like the Zeybeks, which had already existed in Rumelia prior to the Turkish eviction from Rumelia in the Balkan Wars. And after that point, they became their own functional Çete group along the Aegean coast. You also have the creation and the starting of the creation of what was called the Kuvay-i Milliye, or the National Army. And the Kuvay-i Milliye was sort of the agglomeration of all these Mudafa'a Hukuk Jamiyatleri, all of these defensive rights societies. And these societies began to come together in order to promote the welfare of the Turks against the Allies. Now, of course, with this increasing strength of Turks bonding together, you began to see more and more community violence as these Turks began to strike out against Christians as a way of targeting the Entente Powers. So, starting in March of 1919, the Italians were becoming rather restless in the Versailles negotiations, right? Remember, the treaty of, like, all the time that we've been talking so far, Versailles hasn't even been signed yet, let alone any of the other treaties. And there's negotiation for Versailles ongoing. Because of a number of the requirements that the British and the French are imposing on the Italians have literally walked out of the negotiations and are planning an invasion of Turkey, which of the Anatolian Peninsula, which they believe is rightfully theirs. You can see the map where they made their beachhead is that yellow area in the southern part of Turkey. For those of you who are familiar, that's the city of Antalya and its environs. And while they were out of the Versailles negotiations, they were out for about 2 weeks, was when they launched this invasion, and they began to send additional warships from areas that they controlled. In fact, the Italians, for example, controlled the Rhodes and the Dodecanese Islands, which you can see on the map as sort of those olive-colored islands off the coast of southwest Turkey. And the Italian warships, like the Cilicia, although the Cilicia itself was in Constantinople, warships like it were patrolling southern Turkey and southern Turkey and western Turkey. And as I said, on 9th of March, the Italians landed in southern Anatolia. The Italians believed that a significant portion of Anatolia should be their colony or their mandate. However, the system was going to proceed. And the situation began to be diffused a little bit when Italy returned to Versailles, when Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, was willing to resume negotiations again. But the great powers wanted to be sure that they could control the Italian presence in Anatolia and avoid it from becoming a much bigger problem. Separate from that, at this same point, the Pontic Greeks are embracing their own nationalism. They want a Pontic state. And in April of 1919, they meet a number of nobles from the region in order to discuss this possibility. They are led by the Metropolitan, who is similar in rank to a bishop, the Metropolitan of Trebizond, and they decide that they want to declare independence and come under the authority of the Greek state based in Athens. Now, you can see the conversation there between the Metropolitan and Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. Venizelos, though excited by the nationalism felt by the Metropolitan of Trebizond, was deeply worried that the location of Trebizond, so far from any Greek territory currently controlled, remember, it's at the northeastern edge of Turkey, about 500 kilometers away from any Greek territory, never mind the fact that it's on the other side of Constantinople, meaning that somehow Constantinople would have to remain in Greek control to make it even viable, that he told the Metropolitan to stand down. The Metropolitan, of course, refused. And so Pontic nationalism becomes an entity within this territory. And the Pontic Greeks have a particularly vicious memory at this point of the death marches. The city of Samsun, for example, in the western side of this region, had a number of marches all the way to Elazig, and from Elazig all the way to Iran, and that's a march of over 500 kilometers. So getting back to the great powers wanted to stabilize Anatolia, and they wanted to prevent Italian expansion in the region without compensating expansion from the other great powers. So in order to do this, David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister and relatively pro-Greek, met with Eleftherios Venizelos, again, the Prime Minister of Greece, and told him that in order to check the Italian landing at Antalya, that he should land Greek soldiers at the city of Smyrna on the Aegean coast. Now, Venizelos was excited by the possibility of doing this. Now, he didn't believe that Greece had the manpower or the finances to do this alone. But with the support of the British or the French, they could make a go at creating what was called the Megali Idee, or the great idea, that would create a Greek state throughout what is today Greece and parts of what is today Turkey, with a capital at Constantinople, the historic capital of the Greek people. In fact, in the Paris negotiations, Venizelos repeatedly asked for Constantinople to be awarded to Greece because of its historic value to the Greek Orthodox Church. And There's a question as to why would the British and French care about the Italian occupation of Southwest Anatolia. They cared because they had their own spheres of influence that they wanted to carve into Anatolia, and they didn't want the Italians to become too powerful. Just as much as they were worried about their former enemies, the Central Powers, they were worried about Italy, in that Italy was unreliable and quixotic. So they wanted to make sure that it was relatively contained. So on May 15th of 1919, assured Allied funding and additional troops in the future, the Greeks disembarked at Smyrna and were greeted by the local population. Now, it's worth pointing out that the bringing over of troops from the Entente Powers was very unlikely. Ferdinand Foch, who had been one of the chief French generals during World War I, estimated that it would take 27 military brigades to control all of Anatolia. There was absolutely no way that the great powers were going to field this. From just a logistic standpoint, their people and their wealth were spent in World War I. And while they were willing to part with a little bit more gold, they were not willing to part with more men. There's a question here. There was a connection between the British and Greek royal families too, right? Did that play into British interest? I don't believe it did. The connection with the royal family was with King Constantine, and he was more aligned to the Germans than he was to the British through the family relationship. And Eleftherios Venizelos is actually the enemy of King Constantine, so it doesn't really fit. But after the Greeks disembarked at Smyrna, they were greeted happily by the local Greek population, less enthusiastically, let's say, by the Turkish population. Now, the reason such an occupation wasn't necessarily an act of war was that, according to the Armistice at Mudros, signed by Calthorpe and Rauf Orbe on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, the Entente Powers could land or place their military anywhere within the Ottoman Empire where it was deemed necessary to protect the safety of all people involved. And that is what the Allies claimed. Now, of course, it's one thing for Entente powers like France, Italy, or Britain, ones that don't have a direct relationship to the region, to do this. It's another one when Greece does this. And so from the Turkish position on the ground, it looks like Greece is starting an occupation. And that feeling is accentuated when Greek officers pass a Turkish military depot, and a firefight ensues. This firefight leads to some clashes in Smyrna, but by and large, the population is okay. However, the Greeks need to expand their area of control beyond the city itself. And once you get outside the city of Smyrna, the population of Greeks drops dramatically. Now, I sort of want to point this out. In 1912, before World War I, the population is roughly half Muslim and roughly half Christian. That 13% other is primarily constituted by Europeans who lived in Izmir, or Americans because of the tourism industry, as part of the Red Cross, as part of a number of different groups. There were, of course, Jewish populations as well in the city of Smyrna, or Izmir. Izmir is the Turkish name for Smyrna. But of course, we know that after the Turkish War of Independence, Izmir will be 100% Muslim. That diversity in Smyrna itself is not mirrored in the surrounding countryside. The surrounding countryside, as the Greeks begin to expand, is predominantly Turkish. And we're talking about over 80% Turkish in the countryside. So as the Greeks begin to expand to try and formulate their defenses, they increasingly come into conflict with the Mudafe-i Hukuk Cemiyetleri, the defense of rights societies, and with the Çetes. I also want to point out, just so we have an idea of what one Çete massacre looks like, So you can sort of imagine this occurring in miniature. This is one mini example. You can multiply it by 100 or by 200 to sort of have a sense of what's going on all throughout Anatolia. This is the city of Aydın. And Aydın came under a Çete offensive in June of 1919. In this case, the Çetes primarily attacked the Greek Boy Scouts. You can see them on the upper right-hand side, and you can see where Aydın is on the map in the lower right-hand side. Now, 30 or so boys were starved in a basement, and then they were brought out, cut and hacked to pieces. Some were forced to watch while others died. All kinds of grisly atrocities were committed. And then the Çetes stole the property from those families and moved on to the next town. So you can, while in this case, we're talking about maybe 31 to 35 distinct people, this was one incident, and you just multiply that by the number of these encounters with the Çetes. And this was particularly aggravated by the Greek deployment at Smyrna in May of 1919. Now, there's a personality that we need to sort of understand and begin to understand at this point, and that's Mustafa Kemal. And Mustafa Kemal started his military career in the Ottoman Empire. He was a military attaché during the Italo-Turkish War, which was fought primarily in Libya, where he helped train the Mujahideen in Libya to fight against the Italian invaders. He was, but where he really cut his teeth, of course, as we pointed out last time, was in the Battle of Gallipoli, where he famously issued his order, "I don't order you to fight, I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places," referring to the defense of Maltepe and securing Maltepe, which he was able to do, even though his Turkish troops did not have enough ammunition to hold off the Australian soldiers. His ability to secure the mountain effectively meant that the Turks would be able to resist Entente pressure in the south of the Gallipoli Peninsula. After a year of serving there, he also served in other fronts, especially in the Caucasus campaign, and so he was a relatively respected general. But we should also understand what he wasn't. Mustafa Kemal was not a high-ranking CUP party member. He was a part of the CUP, but he was in that secondary level of military cadres and officials, which meant that he wasn't targeted in the Istanbul court-martials of 1919 to 1920. It also meant that he didn't have the Karakol or Black Hand Society reporting to him. They did talk to him, but they didn't report to him. There's a difference. And he had different ideological positions, perhaps, on certain issues than other members of the CUP did. So as a result, it's improper to consider him necessarily a member of the CUP in full alignment with their policies, and it's incorrect to believe that he was the natural successor to the CUP, which is how it's often played in a lot of historical dramas, as if it was inevitable that Mustafa Kemal would become the president of Turkey. Spoiler alert. There's a quick question. Were soldiers and or civilians slaughtering people? Yes. That was quite common in this period. So Mustafa Kemal is one of these people who happens to be just high enough in the organization to have responsibility, but not high enough to get fired when the new administration changes, which is a very enviable spot to be in during this period of dramatic change. So he is appointed by the Sultan-Caliph to go to the city of Samsun, which is in northern Anatolia, to oversee the Turkish soldiers, the Ottoman soldiers that are there, making sure that they are demobilizing, as has been requested by the Entente Powers. And Mustafa Kemal arrives in Samsun on the 19th of May. That's 4 days after the Greeks have just landed at Smyrna. And when he meets those soldiers, he starts inspecting those soldiers. He decides that he's not going to tell them to demobilize. He's actually going to order them to stay mobilized and to join with him. And in fact, he settles in a small town near Samsun named Havza in order to begin promoting Turkish nationalist literature, that the Turks should stand together and fight the invaders. Within a month, he publishes what's called the Amasya Circular, which is a document. You can see this is in the original Ottoman Turkish. It's a document that discusses the problem that is going on in Turkey and discusses the solution that Mustafa Kemal is going to propose in order to remedy the situation. As a first point, the independence of the Ottoman Empire is at risk. This is how Mustafa Kemal frames it. The Entente Powers have concentrated their power in Constantinople. The Sultan is simply doing the work of the Entente Powers, and accordingly, the Turkish people must take upon themselves the duty of rescuing their country. Because of the Entente Powers' presence in Constantinople, the occupation that city is undergoing, the messages and orders coming out of Constantinople are necessarily compromised. They are not ones that the Turkish people should be listening to. They are not a true expression of the Turkish will. He also says that in order to decide what the future of Anatolia will be, what the future of the Ottoman Empire will be, he will hold congresses in Anatolia far outside of the reach of the Entente Powers in order to determine them. He will hold one first in Erzurum to concern the 6 easternmost provinces, and then he will hold one in Sivas for all the Turks from all the provinces to discuss what should be done about the Entente occupation. And finally, Mustafa Kemal argues that the day of diplomacy has ended. The government in Constantinople has demonstrated that that signing an armistice with the Entente Powers would not be respected, and that only by force of arms can the Turkish people impose upon the Entente Powers a solution more in their favor. And the Amasya Circular, of course, is banned by the Ottoman Empire government in Constantinople, but it arouses the national feeling in a number of Turks who have felt with these increasing invasions, right? The Italian invasion in March, the Greek invasion in May, the Istanbul courts martial that had been going on, including the hanging of Mehmet Kemal, all of these kinds of injustices, the Armenians demanding restitution for their homes in Cilicia, it was clear that the Ottoman government was not protecting the interests of the Turkish people. And so the Turks respond very favorably to the idea that maybe there was a different way to deal with the foreigners. In order to enforce the fact that Mustafa Kemal should rescind the Amasya Circular, the Sultan-Caliph sent Musa Kazım Karabekir, one of the predominant World War I generals, to arrest Mustafa Kemal, but Musa Kazım completely refused the order, saying that he didn't quite see the issue with what Mustafa Kemal was promising. Karabekir actually made his way out to these conferences and would become one of the generals in Mustafa Kemal's entourage. Meeting in Erzurum, first in Sanasarian College. Sanasarian College had been a historic Armenian school, but of course, after the Armenian genocide, the building was still there, the Armenians weren't. So they used that building for that first conference. And in Sivas, later, they held a second conference. And the result of this conference was what was called the Misakibili, or the National Pact. And this National Pact would determine the future of what Turkey was supposed to be. Those areas within the National Pact territory, according to Mustafa Kemal, were territories that should be reintegrated into the Ottoman Empire. If they weren't, that could be discussed, of course. Treaties could be made. But it was also the case that the territories that were not in this National Pact were predominantly non-Turkish territories, and therefore it was acceptable to let them go, to let the imperialists take them as part of their mandate system. I also want to give sort of a flavor of what Mustafa Kemal was saying at this point in time and how he understood the Turkish identity. The people who constitute this great assembly of ours are not only the Turks, not only Circassians, not only Kurds, not only the laws, but the community of Muslims that compromises them all. Thus, the nation that we endeavor to preserve and defend naturally does not consist of a single component. It consists of a diverse components of Islam. They are compatriots who have mutual respect for each other, and will always respect each other's ethnic, social, and geographic rights. What's important to notice here is that he is, for want of a better term, a Muslim nationalist, right? He's seeing Muslim as not a religious identifier, but as an ethnic identifier, right? This is an ethno-nationalism where the ethnicity is a religiously defined ethnicity, which is something that, for example, we see in Pakistan, right? When Pakistan broke free from India, they said that they were Muslim Indians, right? They were a variety of different ethnicities. You had Sindhis, Punjabis, Balochis, and Waziris, all the Pashtun people. All of these groups were different. However, they all were Muslim Indians, right? And so that religious identity becomes an ethnic identity. So too, at this point in time, Mustafa Kemal creates this Muslim identity as the identity that he's going to found his Ottoman Empire on. You can also see that Rauf Orbe, the man who actually signed the armistice at Mudros, was at Sivas. He became increasingly aligned with the nationalists led by Kemal in opposing both the Sultan-Caliph in Istanbul and the Entente Powers. As an attempt to create rapprochement between the two sides of, let's say, these two sides of the Turkish world, right? Because we're beginning to see a separation between the government in Ankara, which is Mustafa Kemal's government, called the Grand National Assembly, or GNA. This Grand National Assembly developing in Ankara, and the Ottoman Parliament and Sultanate in Constantinople. There were elections held on the 22nd of October 1919, and members who were sympathetic to the National Pact, which had been issued in September of 1919, were allowed to run. It was an astounding victory for those who believed in the National Pact. And in January of 1920, the Parliament passed a resolution supporting the National Pact, and it was one of the last things the Parliament did before it was dissolved by the Sultan-Caliph. There's a question about whether or not this identity of Muslims overall is the identity that Erdogan is pulling on. I don't think that he's pulling on that in particular. I would say, though, that the AKP, which is Erdogan's political party, pulls on this as a counterweight to the view of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the successor to Mustafa Kemal's political ambitions. If you're looking at the Turkish letters, CHP, Cumhuriyeti Halk Partisi. So the CHP in the years of Atatürk's administration and afterwards began to change that definition of Turk and began to say that the definition of Circassian, of Kurd, of laws, of all these other Muslim ethnicities, these are all fictions and that they're all in truth Turks. The AKP in rejection of that sort of Turkish nationalism, says, no, we want to revert to a Muslim ethno-nationalism, right? That Muslim becomes the identity. And in this way, we can accept different forms of Muslims from an ethnic perspective, right? We can accept Kurds or laws or other things. And in fact, that's how Erdogan justified in the early aughts making peace with the Kurds and giving them more cultural rights, because Kurds are Muslim nationals, so there's no issue there, whereas the CHP might find issues there. All right, if we turn our attention back to the south, we have the situation in Maraş. Now, things began to heat up on the 31st of October 1919 in what's called the Sütçü Imam incident. Sütçü just means milk seller. And so this was the story of this milk seller. Now, the Turks have a very detailed memory of this event. The Armenian memory of it is rather different. So I'll tell you both stories. The Armenian position is that there was a rakıcı, somebody who sells rakı. Rakı is a common kind of alcohol in the south of Turkey. And it's also common in Mesopotamia, where it's called arak. So this rakıcı was a little drunk on his own stuff. He stumbles in front of a hammam, or a bath, and he rips off a woman's hijab, and there's a shootout because Muslim men in the vicinity are astounded and by the impropriety of the act by this Armenian Iraqi seller, and a few people die in the crossfire, except the rakıcı himself is not killed. That's the Armenian story. The Turkish story is this: 3 Turkish women who are in hijabs come out of the hammam. They are accosted by soldiers of the French Armenian Legion. The French soldiers rip off the hijabs of these women and say, "You're in France now. This is no longer a Muslim country. You must accept that." Both the impropriety of ripping off these women's hijabs and the insult that their historic land was now under foreign occupation resulted in a shootout with a number of Turks, including Sütçü Imam. The Armenians are killed, as are some of the Turkish bystanders, and that leads to a wide-scale revolt in Maraş. Of course, the picture here is from a Turkish retelling of the story. And so you can see Sütçü Imam on the right-hand side holding his gun, shooting the Armenian officers in blue, who are ripping off the hijabs of these hijabs and niqabs of these women. So, but after the Sütçü Imam incident, what we begin to see are a bunch of Chetes attacking the city of Maraş and other neighboring towns in the south of Anatolia. The battle in earnest begins in January, where they start moving on the castle at the top of the mountain. The battle takes several weeks, but eventually the French legions are worn down and decide to retreat. The Armenians, of course, in the cities that have been controlled by the French, try as best as they can to retreat with the French, because they know that if they stay, they will be subjected to violence from the Chetes, and that will be unrestrained. So in many cases, you had these Armenians who had come back to their homes after the genocide, only to be removed from those homes and suffer once more. As I pointed out, we're getting to this point in the history of the Ottoman Empire where we have a break between the Grand National Assembly based in Ankara and the Sultan-Caliph based in Istanbul. And in April 10th, it comes to a head when Sheikhul Islam, which is the chief Muslim religious position in the Ottoman Empire, while the Sultan-Caliph does have the spiritual power of being caliph, he's usually not as learned in Islamic literature as the Sheikhul Islam. And so the Sheikhul Islam has the ability to issue what are called fatwa, or religious decisions. And so the Sheikhul Islam Durizade Abdullah Bey Effendi issues his fatwa of 10th of April 1920, in which he argues that the Grand National Assembly, that government in Ankara, are committing takfir or heresy against Islam, that they are not true Muslims, and that it is the duty of the Caliphate to put them down. And accordingly, he authorizes the Sultan to create what was called the Kuvaya Inzibaltiya. The Kuvaya Inzibaltiya doesn't really have a good translation. Inzabat means to push something to be ordered, to enforce order. So I've seen different translations. Sometimes it's called the forces of order. Sometimes it's called the disciplinary forces. Kuvai is usually military or army. And so you have this Kuvai Inzibaltiya, and they begin to march on the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. From the position of modern Turkey, this is usually called the Hilafet Ordusu, or the Caliphate Army, to denote that it was coming from the Caliph. As a result of this, in order to maintain the religious high ground, right? Remember that Mustafa Kemal is fighting on behalf of the ethnic Muslims of Anatolia. He needs Muslim legitimation, that he is not Takfiri, right? Because if he is Takfiri, then he is outside of the Muslim community. He is not part of that ethnic group. And so he seeks help from the Mufti of Ankara, who is Mehmed Rifat. He would eventually get the surname of Berikci. And Mehmed Rifat, along with a number of other muftis in the region, issue a statement also on the 10th of April condemning the fatwa of the Shaykh al-Islam and arguing that, in fact, the Grand National Assembly and its fighters are true Muslims and that the Shaykh al-Islam is the one who is compromised. This leads to a number of different revolts around the region of Düzce and Bolu. You can see the map with that red icon. As you can see, Düzce and Bolu are about halfway between Istanbul and Ankara along the main roads. And a Circassian named Ansoko Ahmed Anzavur takes up arms along with a number of other regime loyalists and fight the Grand National Army on behalf of the Sultan, along with the Kuvay Inzibaltiya. So the Grand National Assembly now has to fight three different forces, right? They have the French in the south. Four different forces. They have the French in the south, the Italians in the southwest, the Greeks in the west, and the forces loyal to the Sultan-Caliph in the northwest. So they decide to deal with the last one first, because to them, holding all Turks in the coalition is the most important piece. And by the end of June 1920, the Kuvay Inzibaltiya is completely disassembled. Many of its members defect to the Grand National Assembly and its Kuvay Milliye, the National Army, and also the uprising by Ansolcu is put down completely. I wanted to describe an incident on the Turkish side as well. This is what's called the Kaç incident. It was part of the French campaign in Cilicia. You can see the Cilician Mountains in the background. This is one of the hospitals in the region of Belmedik. And the French had an air force, which the Turkish Grand National Assembly did not have. Neither did the Çetes. And so we have a situation where the French military bombed out a number of Turkish positions. Belmedik Hospital was the primary hospital of the Turkish soldiers in the region. So in addition to killing people who were in the process of being healed, it prevented future injured victims from being healed as well. Additionally, there are a number of places in the Taurus Mountains that leave very thin passes for troops to move through, and of course, the French took full advantage of these by bombing them and killing. It's estimated roughly 40,000 Turks between the bombing of Belmedik Hospital and the bombing of the surrounding areas in an attempt to curtail the advancing Turkish forces after the fall of Maraş. As I pointed out, the Greeks began to expand their territory from Smyrna in May, right? They started to take the countryside. You can see they took Ayvalık on the 29th of May, but they really began to push forward in the summer of 1920, nearly 1 year later. And you have the Greek generals who were preparing that expansion, and the goal was to take advantage of the summer weather, the summer climate, to advance, as well as this Kuvaya Inzibatia, these forces of order from the Caliphate, and the ongoing French war to divert Turkish resources. And they made significant gains. You can see all of that territory in the dark green were Turkish advances within the summer of 1920. We also see the British supporting the Greeks indirectly by fighting in around the region of Izmit. You can see just east of Constantinople is the city of Izmit, and any nationalists that were caught there were executed by the Greeks and the British. The British were controlling those areas in red around the Sea of Marmara, and accordingly, the nationalists getting close to that was a threat to them. These Greek advances, of course, came on in territory that was deeply hateful towards them, and they would be attacked by Chetes as they advanced forward into Anatolia. Now, the Greeks believed that the reason why there was so much fighting kept continuing, is that there was no treaty on the ground to delimit this. And so this is when, finally, after all of this fighting, after 1 hour 45 minutes of discussion, is when the Treaty of Sevres finally shows up, right? And so this Treaty of Sevres, inaugurated in 1920, tried to establish what would be the final situation of Turkey after the war. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is Armenia, because Armenia so far has remained outside of this war. At this point, Armenia is still dealing with its own Caucasian issues. We'll touch on that in 2 weeks. But Woodrow Wilson demands that as a reparation for the genocide against the Armenians, he doesn't phrase in quite those terms, but that's what he's going for, that there should be an Armenian territory from the Ottoman Empire there should be territory from the Ottoman Empire that is given to Armenia, that would also give Armenia Black Sea coast, and that would include the Pontic Greek regions. There would also be the great powers wanted their own spheres of influence. So you had a British and French sphere of influence in the south of Turkey. You had the Italian zone in the southwest of Turkey. And the Greeks would be given provisional command in the region around Smyrna that they had occupied throughout 1919. But it would be subject to a plebiscite in 5 years. And what would be left would be a Turkish rump state in the northern part of Anatolia, one that would be completely harmless to the Entente Powers. And Sultan Mehmed VI saw no other way around but to sign it. The Grand National Assembly, led by Mustafa Kemal and his chief in command, İsmet İnönü, vehemently protested against the Treaty of Sevres, refused to sign it or recognize it as valid. And in fact, they argued that by doing this, Sultan Mehmed VI had foregone his right to be the leader of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, this was propaganda gold for Mustafa Kemal in terms of recruiting forces for his Kuvve Milliye, his national army, because now it was quite clear that the only way that the Turkish people would be defended is by not accepting the Treaty of Sevres. So now we turn to the east and the Turkish-Armenian Wars. So just after the Treaty of Sevres, we began to see Musa Kazım Karabekir ordered to take care of the Armenian front and prevent the Armenians from taking the area accorded to them by Wilson. So he starts fighting in the city of Oltu, which is in what is today Turkey. As at that time, it was part of Armenia because it had been under Russian control prior to 1914. And you can see he leads a number of battles, getting closer and closer to the Armenian capital of Yerevan, winning battles at Kars, winning battles at Jumri, battles at Iğdır, all these kinds of places. And as he's going, his forces are massacring large numbers of Armenians. It's estimated that between 60 and 100,000 Armenian civilians are killed during this Turkish advance. And as Turks take some of the more important positions like Kars, which had a massive fortress that Armenians simply couldn't man, there weren't enough of them, and they weren't well enough trained, you began to have a situation that was becoming increasingly dire. Hamazasp Ohajanian, who was the leader, the prime minister of Armenia, starting in May of 1920 until he resigned in November of 1920 to allow the ceasefire to be discussed, had a very anti-communist perspective and a very pro-Entente perspective, hoping that the Entente powers would help him. None of them did. And that was what effectively led to the Turkish victory, the Turks being significantly more organized. In order to stop the battle, on 18th November, he ordered a ceasefire and he sent his diplomats to negotiate with Musa Kazım in order to create a ceasefire. That ceasefire would later lead to the Treaty of Jumri, but the Treaty of Jumri is a very strange treaty, and I'll explain why. During the same period, the Soviets were advancing throughout the Caucasus region and trying to bring the Caucasus states under Soviet control. Into this, you have Lenin asking Stalin to send somebody from the Caucasus to persuade the Armenians to join. And this person was Sergo Orjonikidze. And Orjonikidze was ethnically Georgian, but he knew the area relatively well, and he ended up speaking to the Armenian leadership in Yerevan. Between the advancing Turks in the west and the Soviets marching from the east, the Armenians decided that surrender to the Soviets would be better than surrender to the Turks, especially as the Turks were continuing to massacre Armenians and were not interested in atoning for the genocide. So on the 2nd of December 1920, the Armenian government officially folded, and Armenia became Armenia SSR, Armenia Soviet Socialist Republic, and the government led by Ohajanian and other Dashnaks effectively they all became outlaws and were persecuted by the new Soviet regime, but the Armenian people remained safe. Now, since the Treaty of Jumri was signed on the 3rd of December, one day after Armenia stopped being an independent republic, the treaty itself has no legal value. And as you can see, the treaty actually gave the region of Nakhchivan, which is today part of Azerbaijan, to Turkey. Most of the terms of the Treaty of Jumri would become part of the treaties between Turkey and the Soviet Union following this, especially the Treaty of Kars of 1921. Now, there's a question here: what were all these different groups fighting? What were they trying to achieve? Okay, the Turks were trying to recover the territory that they had, that they felt was rightfully theirs. It had historically been part of the Ottoman Empire for about 500 years. Most of what's in there labeled as Wilsonian Armenia, as well as those areas in orange, light orange, have historically been part of the Ottoman Empire, and were only taken by Russia in the case of the light orange areas in 1878, in case of the yellow areas since 1914, And there was a feeling in Turkey that if the Armenians were allowed to survive, they would continue to make problems for the Turks. And also, the Armenians were sitting in the middle between Turkey and the Azerbaijanis, who were their fellow Turks, and therefore they could create that grand Turan state, right? That grand Turkish state across the Caucasus Mountains, if only the Armenians were not in the way. From the Soviet perspective, the Soviet Union considered itself the successor state to the Russian Tsardom and felt that all the lands of the Russian Tsardom should become part of the Soviet Union. So that was the Soviet position. And the Armenians were fighting for independence because they felt that after the genocide, they should be the ones to determine their own fate. And it turns out that you can't just say that, you need military strength, some arms to defend it. So when we get to the end of 1920, we have a very strange situation happen. The current king of Greece, Alexander I, gets bitten by his pet Barbary macaque on the 2nd of October, 1920. And this results in an infection that ends up killing him. And this leads open a succession crisis to the kingship of Greece. Now, Eleftherios Venizelos and the former king, Constantine I, had a large number of disagreements, right? Constantine I wanted to be neutral or pro Central Powers in the First World War because of his connection to the German Kaiser. Venizelos was very much in the camp of the Entente. But now it seems that people want Constantine I to return. And they elect, surprisingly to Venizelos, a very conservative government, a pro-monarchist government, and that sees they have a plebiscite, and the Greek people agree that Constantine I should return, and he does in early December 1920. Now, the reason that Venizelos loses the election is because Greece has basically been at war since 1912, and Constantine is saying that he will likely end the war. Many Greeks are excited by this possibility, and so they welcome him back. This, though, was a feeling that the Greeks had, but non-Greeks didn't share. The Entente Powers met at what was called the Second London Conference and issued a joint statement on the 2nd of December 1920. While the Italians and French had already been anxious to ditch the Greeks, for want of a better term, the French, because they were sort of losing their war in Anatolia, and they sort of felt that they'd rather deal with the economics of an independent Ottoman Empire that could pay reparations, and the Italians, because the Greek claims and the Italian claims overlapped. The fact that they were opposed to Greece should not be that surprising. But David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, had been Greece's champion among the Entente Powers for quite a while, but even he signed on to this new statement, which was the restoration to the throne of Greece of a king whose disloyal attitude and conduct towards the Entente during the war caused them great embarrassment and loss could only be regarded by them as a ratification by Greece of his hostile acts. Basically saying that the Greeks were looking at the Entente Powers like a gift horse in the mouth and turning them away, so too would they turn away Greece. It should also be mentioned that many of Venizelos' commanders who were in Anatolia were relatively seasoned generals, but those who were serving with Constantine, they were by and large not as well educated. Many of them were, for want of a better term, fanboys more than anything else. And in fact, after Greece loses this war, there will be what's called the Trial of Six, where 6 of those individuals who supported Constantine I would be hanged for their crimes against the Greek state, generally their incompetence. Now, starting in early 1921, you have what are called the battles of Inonu, the first and second battle of Inonu in January and March of 1921. Now, at this point, you begin to have Mustafa Kemal beginning to try and organize all the different Çetes, Mudafe Hukuk Cemiyetleri, all these different Turkish fighting forces into one national military under his direct command. There were some militaries that resisted. For example, Çerkesetem, who was a Circassian, did not want his military to join with Mustafa Kemal. But Mustafa Kemal then turned his guns on him and took away his army and would later imprison him for treason. The victories here were decisive, not in the sense that they stopped the Greek advance. In fact, we're going to talk about the summer advance of 1921 as well, but that they brought the Greeks to the negotiating table. And you began to have what was called the London Conference, where the Turks and the Greeks were beginning to negotiate, and the Grand National Assembly was being seen increasingly as the representative of the Turkish people, not the Ottoman government in Constantinople. But since the London Conference was adamant that the Treaty of Sevres be used as a basis of negotiations, the Grand National Assembly leadership was able to just walk out of those negotiations. In the south, the French were able to lay siege to the city of Antep, which is known today by the name Gaziantep, if you're familiar with the map. And the siege began in April 1920, and it lasted until February of 1921. It was a grueling set of 10 months where this city, which was under Turkish control, kept the French out until everything was exhausted. The people were starved. Metal from plates was being turned into bullets. The Turks were fighting to defend their territory. And finally, the French broke through in February of 1921. But considering the loss of Maraş, the loss of Urfa, the loss of significant areas in Cilicia, other than Antep, the French decided, given the economic possibilities that the Grand National Assembly would offer if it became victorious, they authored what was called the Cilicia Peace Treaty, barely a month after winning the siege of Antep. While this Cilicia Peace Treaty would eventually have to be superseded by the Treaty of Ankara in October, this treaty basically delimited that all of the areas claimed by the National Pact north of Syria would go to the Ottoman Empire in exchange for the Ottoman Empire in exchange for the Grand National Assembly respecting that the territories south of that line would belong to the French. The one exception being that the Sanjak of Alexandretta, today known as Hatay province of Turkey, would have a plebiscite in the 1930s to determine whether it should belong to Turkey or belong to Syria. But these treaties effectively meant that France was out of the war. We will cover the rest of this story and how the Turkish War of Independence ends next week before I start taking questions. But any questions, comments, concerns on what you've heard about today?
Yeah, Rich, I have a question if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
You got into it a little bit, and maybe I'm asking you to repeat, but when the Armenians accepted Soviet domination in order to prevent the Turks, there would have been government leaders and such of that government of Armenia. What happened to them when the Soviets took over?
Well, the Soviets just replaced them.
They weren't shot.
If you're talking about the highest level of bureaucrats, right? You're talking about the prime ministers and the cabinet ministers. Those were all replaced. There were Soviet-leaning Armenians who were outside of Armenia at the time. They were able to be brought in. Shahumyan is a perfect example of this. And that's the top level of leadership. When you get to like the people, the head of the sanitation department, right? Those people stay because it doesn't make sense to replace them. So that's sort of what happened there. And the Dashnaks who were in power, they were subject to a number of Soviet purges that started almost immediately. And in fact, there were revolts from Dashnaks in 1921. I'm going to cover it on the Caucasian War side I didn't feel like it was necessary to cover it here because it doesn't affect the Turkish War of Independence.
And the Dashnaq was what?
Dashnat Sütçü, the Armenian Revolutionary Front.
Okay, thanks.
It was a militant group and terrorist group, depending on, yeah, I would say it's a terrorist group, founded in 1890 in Russia. If you go back through several of the presentations, especially in the early 40s, they come up quite commonly. They're part of the Armenian resistance to Ottoman domination, but they definitely have a Russian link. But of course, since they're connected to the Russian Tsardom, they're not in line with the Soviet Union.
Why did the Greeks continue to march east into territory that was basically 100% Turkish without the, I mean, they weren't going to take that over. Were
Sure.
they trying to just ultimately defeat and the Turkish army and bring them to a negotiation table so they'd have more leverage?
Absolutely. Basically, right, the question was, this Grand National Assembly that's based in Ankara is what's causing the Ottoman Empire to be unable to comply with the demands of the Entente Powers. Because for all intents and purposes, Sultan Mehmet VI was compliant, right? He signed the Treaty of Sevres. He seemed willing to accept whatever the Entente Powers would throw at him. So he wasn't the issue. The issue was the Grand National Assembly. And we can think of it as Mustafa Kemal, but there was a whole Congress in Sivas, right, in September of 1919. And all those people were members of the Grand National Assembly. So the question becomes, right, how do you deal with this problem? And the Greeks knew that they were stuck in Smyrna and they wanted to hold on to Smyrna because of its large Christian population. So if they were going to have any chance at that, at realizing the Megali Idea, perhaps making the Pontus part of Greece, you never know. Perhaps annexing Constantinople, again, you never know. They needed to remove the Grand National Assembly as a threat. And so that's what the primary goal of those expansionary wars were.
Thank you.
There's a question of how did the Spanish flu impact all the wars? That's actually really important. By this point in 1919 and 1920, we're sort of towards the end of that. The Spanish flu had a much bigger effect in World War I in 1918. We talked about it a little bit when we talked about Austria-Hungary collapsing. One of the main reasons that Austria-Hungary collapsed was the Spanish flu. It wrecked whatever troop morale there still was. I mean, Austria-Hungary is rather notable in that significant parts of the army just defected or went AWOL. Less like around a quarter of Austro-Hungarians who went out to fight survived but didn't come back. And Spanish flu definitely did a number there. It did a number on a lot of the fronts. Its particular impact here in Anatolia is much less felt, though. So it's not as critical as it was, for example, as I said, in Austria-Hungary.
Just want to thank you again, Richard. Great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. As I said, I'll finish up this presentation next week. The links to those presentations should be in the various meetup groups that you're a part of. If not, you can join the meetup group in the comments, or you can join the meetup group in the comments, which is the New York Museum Food and Travel Lovers. It's there for next week, Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I look forward to seeing you guys there. There's a question, seems few, if any, of the various powers could have foreseen the severe reduction in Christian influence a mere 100 years later. It's not, I would say that the powers couldn't have foreseen that the Christian religion would be so weak of a binding force. The Christian majority powers are still quite powerful today. The United States is still the most powerful country in the world. It's just that it doesn't operate according to, let's save them because they're Christians. That doesn't seem to be a very compelling argument, as much as the Republican Party would like to pretend it is. But But the real loss of Britain and France in the international space was the result of the Suez Crisis, right? Because when Eisenhower was able to compel Britain and France to take a different political objective in the Suez Crisis, it made clear that the United States was the ascendant power, and those in the time of those empires, the French and the British, had gone. But this was their time. And thank you for all the kind words that you've all been saying. That it's really lovely. If there's nothing else, though, again, I look forward to seeing you next week, and good night.